All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of the ENO Center for Transportation webinars. I'm Alice Grossman, a policy analyst here at the ENO Center for Transportation, and today we are talking about DC's Dockless bike share pilot. We're going to try and understand a little bit more about bike share programs and partnerships with cities, and we are happy to be joined by Dr. Stefanie Brodie. Dr. Brodie is a research program specialist at the District Department of Transportation. She's been very involved with the Dockless bike sharing pilot in Washington, D.C., and she's going to share with us a little bit about the state of bike share around the nation, specifics within the district, focusing a lot on the areas of equity, data, and viability. Afterwards, we're going to have plenty of time for questions. Please feel free to enter your questions in the question box on the side of your screen at any time, and we will get to as many of those as possible after the presentation. We think that you will all find this discussion very timely and interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and I'm going to hand it over to Stefanie.
Great, thank you, Alice. As Alice mentioned, my name is Stefanie Brodie, and I am a research program specialist at DDOT. As the title would suggest, I know a little bit about a lot and a lot about research. So I'm not a bike share expert, but I have been involved with managing the research efforts around the Dockless bike share pilot and for the evaluation of this pilot program. So today I'll talk to you about bike share in general, nationally and in DC, and then focus in on Dockless bike share and do the same in the national context and also in DC, and in doing so talk a bit about the program that we have here and the initial some initial analysis results. And I'll focus on three key factors that are in discussion nationally and also in DC, and those factors being equity, data sharing, and company viability. So Dockless bike sharing may be new, but bike sharing is not new to the U.S. It entered the U.S. market around 2010, and since then it has been growing substantially. In 2017, NACDO reported that there have been 35 million bike share trips taken. In DC, we got on the ground floor of bike sharing, and in 2008, we had Smart Bike DC, which was the first public bike sharing system in the U.S. At that time, we also had about 7,000 bike commuters, about 30 lanes of bike network, and around 700 bike racks in downtown DC. In 2010, Smart Bike DC became Capital Bike Share, and currently Capital Bike Share has around 200 stations in the district and 400 regionally, about 4,000 bikes, and it is expanding currently. Also in 2018, 10 years after Smart Bike DC launched, there are about 17,000 bike commuters in the district. We have over 80 miles of bike lane network. That includes 8 miles of protected bike lanes and 3,500 bike racks in downtown DC. Dockless bike share adds up to 2,000 bikes for public rental in the city. And all this supports DC's goals of improving and increasing active transportation. And I'll talk more about DC's goals around bicycle infrastructure and transportation in general, because they're very important when courting Dockless bike share or when Dockless bike share is courting your city. So we can't talk about Dockless bike share without talking about how it entered the market in China. And we're all pretty used to seeing these pictures of bike graveyards. Dockless bike share entered the shared mobility market in China in around 2015, and the picture is a little bit different in the United States. It entered into the U.S. market in 2017, mid to late 2017, and the map shown here is another from NACDO's recent report on bike sharing in the U.S. And what you'll see is the darker circles represent systems and cities that have station-based programs. The lighter ones show Dockless, and the orange ones show station-based and Dockless programs. And you'll see DC, the orange dot, in the mid-Atlantic. A little bit to the north of us, we have Montgomery County, which has a Dockless system, and farther north is Baltimore, that has a station-based system. If If we look at the number of assets that are actually on the ground across the country, we'll see that Dockless bike share makes up about 44%, and station-based bike share makes up around 56%, which is pretty comparable. However, if we look at the actual trips per station-based and Dockless trips, we see that station-based trips make up the vast majority of the Dockless, the bike share trips that are being taken. One caveat here is that, as I mentioned, Dockless bike share entered towards the end of 2017, so there's a few months of data for Dockless bike share and a full year of data for station-based bike share. So if we think about Dockless bike share in DC and we look at the pilot program that we have here, it launched September 20th of 2017 for a 7-month pilot period. And in this time, we wanted to understand the market demand for bike share, for Dockless bike share, also approaches to regulating Dockless bike share, and how we might develop relationships with the operators. The bikes that you see in the pictured below are the 5 bike share operators that we have in the district: Spin Bike, OFO, Mobike, Lime Bike, and Jump Bike, which provides e-assist vehicles. We also have 2 scooter operators, Waybots and Bird, and Lime Bike also provides scooters and e-assist bicycles. The demonstration pilot period began in September 2017 and was scheduled to end at the end of April this year. However, it was extended through August 30th. This allows bike share operators to operate under a public right-of-way occupancy permit that defines some basic requirements. Among those, companies must have at least 50 and no more than 400 bicycles. There are bicycle specifications that are laid out in terms of safety and having contact information and branding on the bicycles. They must also be distributed across all wards of the city. Bike share companies are required to provide us with monthly data reporting, and they have parking requirements they must adhere to. These include leaving at least 5 feet of pedestrian space, not blocking entrances or driveways, not blocking Capital Bike Share stations, and not blocking any traffic for motor vehicles or other bicycles. They also can't be parked in tree boxes or planting areas. So with this background of Dockless bike share in DC and nationally, as well as background on bike sharing nationally in DC, I'd like to share some of the initial analysis that we have from the DC Dockless pilot. One of the first questions we had was, how does Capital Bike Share and how will Dockless Bike Share interact? We're one of the few cities that have both a station-based system and Dockless Bike Share operating at the same time. And Capital Bike Share is a very successful program that we have. We consider it public transit, as it is publicly owned and operated as such. It has about 80% fare box recovery, so it's a very successful transit program. DC has invested both physical and financial investment into Capital Bike Share, so we have an interest in seeing it succeed. With emergent technology, Dockless Bike Share has been able to increase the number of assets that we actually have on the ground. This is not to say that, so this allows us to have these assets on without any capital investment, but this is not to say it's a free program at all. There's staff time invested, and then there's also the evaluation of the public space. So the first question was, what does Capital Bike Share and Dockless Bike Share equal when they're added together? This graph shows a general additive effect. So you can see along the lines of the blue and gray lines, Capital Bike Share trips for the last couple years, and in the red bars, you'll see the Capital Bike Share trips for the last quarter when Dockless Bike Share was introduced, as well as on top of that, the lighter red shows Dockless Bike Share trips. And this is actually getting updated currently to provide some more information on the first quarter data. And now I'll show a little bit of geospatial analysis. This map shows trip starts within the district. So for each point, it's colored based on where the trip ends. So for example, in Ward 3, which is the northwest quadrant of the city, which is the northwest quadrant of the city, you'll see that the purple dots represent trips that started in Ward 3 and ended in Ward 3, and those that are green started in Ward 3 and ended in Ward 2. What this map shows is that most of the trips started and ended in the same ward, and there's a big concentration of trips that are in Ward 2, 6, and 1. If we dig down a little deeper into the numerical support for this map, we'll see that there are high concentrations in the Central Business District, which is in Wards 2 and 6. About half of the bikes started in Ward 2 in quarter 4 of 2017, and a quarter in Ward 6. So if we think about this, it brings us to one of the first points one of the first key factors that I want to talk about, which is equity. We're requiring bikes to operate in all 8 wards of the city, and they are, but there are concentrations that we should keep in mind. This map was produced by Virginia Tech Planning Studio that's been working with us over the last semester to analyze some equity impacts. And what you see here are red dots corresponding to capital bike share stations, and they are sized based on the number of trips that started at those locations. The blue heat map shows Dockless bike share trip starts. And again, you'll see the concentration of trips that are within Wards 2, 6, and 1. But what you will note is that in Ward 7 and 8, which are predominantly lower income areas, you don't see the same level of activity. And this might lead us to pause on the assertion that Dockless bike share is reaching locations that capital bike share is not. You also see that Dockless bike share is clustered around either capital bike share stations or metro stations outside of the Central Business District. If we, again, drill down a little deeper into some numerical support for this, you'll see that we have 2 heat map matrices. On the right, there is one for capital bike share trips, and on the left for Dockless bike share trips. And along the left-hand side of either of these matrices, you'll see that this shows the wards in which the trips ended, and on the bottom, the wards in which the trips started. So again, we'll see that for the Dockless bike share trips, inter-wardal trips are fairly high in comparison to other trips. And you'll see that Ward 2 and 6 have high percentages of trips. This is also mirrored in capital bike share trips. One of the things that we can note in terms of Ward 7 and 8 are that Dockless bike share trips proportionally are double that. So trips starting and ending in Ward 8 in capital bike share trips are about 0.2%, and in Dockless bike share about 0.5%. But it's also important to note that these are all under 1%, so the impact is a little less than we might hope. Furthermore, looking at trips based on ward doesn't give you a fine-grained impression on where these trips are heading or where they're starting. So one of the things that we would like to do is to look more fine-grained and dig into the data to show where exactly these trips are. And in terms of digging into data, this brings us to our second point, or a second key factor, data sharing. Currently, companies are required to provide a public API along with anonymized trip data, information on parking and safety incidents, and information on repairs and maintenance. All this data is made possible, all the analysis that we've done has been made possible by operator monthly reporting. And we collect and use this data in order to allow us to evaluate the program and for our future planning efforts. One of the ways that we're using this data currently is to evaluate bike parking locations. The data is collected via the permit, and it adds value to allowing these companies to operate in the public right-of-way. This data is sensitive, so we want to make sure that we're keeping it secure and confidential. And we also want to ensure that the data that we're being provided by the companies is accurate. And to these 2 points, we've been involved in national efforts to develop data sharing recommendations for bike share, for Dockless bike share. And it's my personal opinion, but also a national and international opinion, that in allowing Dockless bike share operators to operate in the public right-of-way, data sharing should be a requirement. So on to the third factor, along with equity and data sharing, that we should keep in mind for Dockless bike share is company viability. It's important to remember that these companies are funded by venture capital. And as I mentioned before, Capital Bike Share is a very successful bike share program, and it provides 80% fare box recovery. So it's not necessarily the case that bike share will turn a profit, so we have to understand what the goals are of these companies. And these can range from a variety of things. Some of the companies have stated interest in either using the data to provide a value to governments or other entities, as well as being a mobility platform that will incorporate not just bike sharing, but car sharing and transit as well. Because the goals aren't clear, sometimes we want to make sure that there's cooperation with cities. In doing so, the model in the U.S. is quite different than that in China. Companies have, for the most part, interacted and engaged with cities. And this might be in part because of regulations that have been levied for Dockless bike share. But in cooperating with bike share companies, Dockless bike share companies, it allows us to put our priorities at the forefront. And one of the key things that I want to impart to you from this webinar is that because of these 3 factors of equity, data sharing, and company viability, regardless of those, and adding any of the many concerns off of the menu of Dockless bike share concerns, one thing that we should keep in the forefront is our city goals for transportation. In DC, we have several goals that are put forth by Move DC, and some of them are specifically related or directly related to Dockless bike share. These being that we want 75% of our commute mode share being non-auto modes. We want to maximize system reliability and capability and capacity. We also want to increase choices, coverage, and accessibility via our transportation network. And we want to achieve Vision Zero. So while the future of Dockless might be uncertain, it's important to make sure that our decisions that we're making around Dockless support our broader transportation goals. In addition to goals that are stated in Move DC, DC and DDOT also want to make sure that we're supporting innovation and increasing our ability to make data-driven decisions. So I'll close with DDOT's mission, which is to enhance the quality of life for district residents and visitors by ensuring that people, goods, and information are moved efficiently, safely, and with minimal adverse effects on the residents and the environment. So thank you for your time, and here's my contact information.
All right, thank you, Stefanie. That was very informative. Lots of good data and insights there. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in, and if any of you still have questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask them in the question box on the side of your screen. In answer to a bunch of questions, we are going to upload a video of the webinar to our website. and you can access that with the same link that you used to access the webinar. And I'm just going to jump into some of the questions that we have coming in for Stefanie. Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between bike share and transit? And there were some specific questions about bike share at transit stops and stations and the use of space there, and parking for cabbie versus dockless bikes versus vehicles, etc.
Okay, that's a lot. Let me start with, I guess, some of the issues around where bikes can be parked. So at the metro stations, they're allowed to be parked adjacent to but not on metro property. So bikes can be parked in public space, in the furniture zone, which is kind of that area where tree boxes might be, where we might find parking meters, and along that area of the sidewalk. So they're not allowed to be on metro property, but they can be adjacent in those areas. And as you saw from some of the Virginia Tech data, there are a lot of trip starts that happen around metro stops. Bikes can be parked around Capitol Bike Share stations as well, as long as they're not actually in the stations. And I think you wanted some insight on what the interaction is between transit and bike share. Again, you can see kind of from the geospatial data that a lot of trips are happening around, or are starting around metro.
All right. The next one is about user education. What do you think we need in terms of user education around the either docked or dockless bike share? And kind of what, as an overview, what's been done, and what do you think we need to do moving on into the future?
Well, I'll say one issue that DC and other cities are facing is the issue of improper parking. So one of the main things that we want to do is educate users on where they should be parking. So this is something that can be done via the Dockless company's apps as well. So identifying and explaining how and where people should park is definitely one element of public education that can be improved.
What variables, when you were deciding on restrictions for the use of the bikes and the docking areas of the bikes, you mentioned that you can't park them in tree boxes, and I think there's also zones that you can't park them in. Is that true, along the mall or?
Yes, so they're allowed to be within DDOT operated public space, or public right of way. Along the mall and a lot of the pocket parks in DC are not DDOT space. That is National Park Service land. So they're not permanent on National Park Service land, so they're not allowed to be parked in those spaces. So, and they're also not allowed to be on private property. So as long as the bikes are within DDOT permittable public right of way, then as long as they're not within that, then they're not illegally parked. However, we also want to make sure that we're leaving clear space for pedestrians, those who have accessibility needs as well, and making sure that they're not obstructions to transportation or travel.
Yeah. And actually related to that, do you know if there has been, as of yet or will be in the future, any discussions within DDOT about infrastructure needs, whether that means on sidewalks? If it seems like people really are noticing accessibility issues that maybe they weren't before, and there are certainly other elements of pedestrian right-of-ways that could stand for improved ADA accessibility. But then also in terms of bicycle infrastructure, is there an anticipated increased need for bicycle infrastructure, or revisiting maintenance needs of what we have? Is there a connection there now, or will there be in the future?
I think we would love to hear about areas that can be improved for ADA accessibility. So that's one thing. But in terms of bicycle infrastructure, as I mentioned, some of the data that we're getting from the companies can provide insight on where we can improve. So identifying areas for more bike parking, understanding trip routes, or high trafficked areas that might be in need of improved bicycle infrastructure in terms of lanes or protected lanes, et cetera. So one of the benefits of the data sharing with Dockless bike share companies is that it allows us to have more information on how we should plan for bicycling within DC.
Got it. In regards to the equity issues, and I know that's another area of your expertise, do you think that increasing that 400 bicycle cap would have an impact on distribution of bicycles or equity in terms of availability, or if there are other changes also, maybe not increasing that cap, but anything else that might help work towards the DDOT equity goals?
It's very possible. It's hard to tell because we have 7 operators in the program. There's a fairly high number of vehicles in the system, but not necessarily within one company. So it's hard to tell whether financial incentives would change if we provide a higher cap of vehicles. That's kind of left to be seen. I will say that Virginia Tech also did some surveying, and though it was a small sample, the initial results suggest that while Dockless is not necessarily reaching different geographical locations, they may be reaching different population segments, and that includes lower income populations, minority populations, and women.
Excellent. You might not be able to answer this one, but I imagine it's a question that a lot of people have on their minds. Did any specific Dockless company out of all of the ones that are piloting right now perform either significantly better or just differently in different ways than other companies in terms of the trips or the demographics, the quality of service? And maybe you can't give specific names, but are there any insights or differences that you've noticed that are interesting that you could point out?
Yeah, you had it right at first. I will not be answering that question.
Worth a try. The chart that you showed with the number of trips over time, it looked like Dockless trips might have been decreasing over the last quarter. Is that correct? And what do you think is happening there?
So the chart I showed did not show data from February and March for Dockless bike share. However, it was very cold in February and March as well, and it was the winter period. So even with Capital Bike Share, we see a dip around November through January in terms of biking. So it's probably weather related, and that would probably be the gist, the bulk of what's happening in terms of changes in trips.
All right. So we're here at 4:30 now. There's a lot of questions still, so I think we'll stay on the line for another 5 minutes and just hit a couple more questions. But thanks to everybody who joined us who might be having to dip out now. Stefanie, were there any requirements as towards the quality or type of bicycles for the Dockless companies coming in? And were there any relations to like rider safety or anything like that, or any thoughts as to like tricycles or different types of bikes also?
Yes, so there weren't any specific types of bicycles that were required. However, there are safety standards. The standard safety standards were required for all bikes, so the ISO standards. We have thought about the opportunity to include adaptive bikes within fleets to address some of the accessibility issues. However, in terms of the actual hardware of the assets, the only requirements are standard safety.
Are there any examples that Dockless bike share companies have had really positive or really negative partnerships with other cities around the country that you are familiar with and were able to learn from yet?
Yes, it seems like every city is doing it a little bit differently, so there are a lot of examples to pull from. Seattle is one of the first cities that has permitted Dockless bike share, so they're a little bit farther along than most cities, and I think a lot of cities can kind of look to see what Seattle's doing and learn from that. Dallas Dallas launched without regulation, so that's a different model than most cities are approached with. There's also cities who have station-based systems who were a little more cautious in terms of allowing Dockless bike share to launch. So cities like New York and Chicago and Boston, which are now allowing Dockless to enter in either restricted areas or in scaled ways. So there's a menu of options in terms of launching Dockless bike share across the country.
Awesome. I think we'll do one more here. Are you able to talk at all about the cost of both operating Cabby versus the Dockless, and then also the cost to the user for Cabby versus the Dockless?
So I can start with the cost to the user. So Capital Bike Share has a yearly membership option, as well as some day passes and single trip usage. So the annual membership is about $85, and the prices scale down to $2 per trip. So for a person off the street, they can go to a Cabby station and then rent a bike for $2. On the other hand, Dockless bike share is typically $1 per ride, so that ride might be either 30 minutes before usage fees kick in or an hour before usage fees kick in, depending on the company. In terms of the cost for DDOT, DDOT owns and operates owns a portion of Capital Bike Share, and we have an operator that runs the program for us. So we have an invested financial interest in Capital Bike Share. On the other hand, for Dockless bike share, we don't have the same investment there, but we do have staff that are helping to manage the program. So there's not the same dedicated cost, but there's definitely a cost that we see in operations for Dockless as well.
Great. All right. So I think we've passed our time now. Thank you so much, Stefanie, for joining us today, and thank you everybody else for listening in and for all of your great questions. ENO is going to stay engaged on this issue as the DC pilot moves forward, and as other programs on a national scale evolve and move forward. We do want to give everybody online a reminder that we've got a couple other events coming up. There's a webinar on the CAFE and greenhouse gas emission standards. And we have our annual Leadership Development Conference dinner on May 24th coming up as well. You can learn more about both of those events, and you can register for them on our website, which is enotrans.org. Where you can also check out Eno Transportation Weekly, which I'd encourage you to all check out. So again, thank you, Stefanie, and thank you all for listening in, and everybody have a great afternoon.